Good Sunday morning. I'm Susan Pertnoy. Welcome to Mosaic, Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County's weekly news magazine show. Mosaic explores Jewish topics here in the Palm Beaches and around the world. On this morning's episode of Mosaic, we have a very special guest, David Gregory. You probably know David as the former moderator of Meet the Press, and today as political analyst for CNN. What you may not know is his unique connection with his Jewish identity and the significant role it has played in his life and career. David chronicled his self-proclaimed unlikely spiritual journey in his best-selling book, How's Your Faith? This morning, we'll explore this and more with David Gregory. We'll be right back after this brief message.
What if you could change the world? You can. We can do it together. Federation and you. Changing the world together.
Welcome, David Gregory, journalist extraordinaire and now an author of How's Your Faith? You could have written an expose on all sorts of journalistic things in Washington. Why did you choose to write a book about your faith?
Well, I think it's something that's been increasingly important to me, in the world, just as a person, as a husband and a father, and even as a journalist. I think it was, a question of identity, a fundamental question of who are we? I think one of the things the Federation does around the country is ultimately try to speak to that core question, which is, who are we as Jews? What does it mean to be Jewish? It's something that I had grappled with for a long time, going back to an upbringing from an interfaith family and having a mother who's not Jewish, a father who was, being bar mitzvahed and being on that path. But then being a father myself and leading my own family with a wife who's not Jewish, but feeling very strongly about my identity that I wanted to really understand better. So to me, it really became this animating question of what does it mean to be Jewish? And then the question that a lot of Jews don't like to ask, which is, where is God? Those two questions are really important to, my idea of faith, my idea of Jewish identity. And I think, I'm passionate about it. It's something I care a lot about. I think it's fundamentally important to, who we are, to becoming better people. I think that those things are more important, and I felt I had a little bit more to say because the book is an exploration of not only those questions for myself, but posing those questions kind of journalistically to faith leaders of all faiths to try to get some perspective on what it means to be on any kind of spiritual search.
So why did you call it an unlikely spiritual journey?
Well, because, like a lot of Jews, I grew up culturally Jewish, ethnically Jewish, grew up in Southern California, didn't have much faith, didn't have much understanding of Jewish religion. Had an identity that was, again, a primarily cultural identity. How many of us are just Jews by virtue of how we grew up, who our parents are, where we live, what, holidays we might observe, however, secularly we observe them. And so I think for me it was unusual that I would come from the background I came from, get into elite media circles, to be a White House correspondent, to be the moderator of Meet the Press, and all the while in that turbulent, environment of TV news, to start asking these more penetrating questions. So for me to get on a path of really trying to understand God and understand God's role in my life was something that I could have never imagined. Certainly not as I was growing up, and not even in my younger adulthood would I have thought it something reasonable.
Speaking of growing up, I was curious. You were a son of a Catholic mother and a Jewish father. Why did you choose, or why did your family choose Judaism instead of Catholicism?
Well, my mother was not religious. My mother lost their first child, who was stillborn, and the process of going through that in a Catholic hospital, my mother found very cold. The emphasis in the Catholic tradition on naming the child, even as stillborn, was something that kind of threw out her belief and that she had grown up with at that point. And so she really ceded that ground to my father. And my father was not religious at all. and baptized my sister, whereas I was not. And I'd be on a Jewish path. We ultimately were both raised as Jews because I think, just again, who he was, and that was a decision that they made.
And then you fell in love with Beth,
Yeah.
who is a Methodist.
Yeah, Protestant, grew up in the Methodist Church in New England.
And yet, when you decided to deal with the idea of having children, once again, where did it come from that you wanted them to be raised Jewish?
Well, I just think it was more identity. I mean, I think what, as Jews we understand is that sense of family. I don't mean our immediate families, the sense of Jews and the Jewish community as a family, that it's important, this kind of tribal, ethnic bond that we have around the world. And I think that was kind of the guiding principle for me. I mean, I just thought, oh my gosh, my father would go crazy if I didn't have Jewish children. But it never even, and I say this kind of, selfishly, being aware that was selfish, it never occurred to me that my children would not be Jewish. But Beth, being a strong person of faith herself, it was not unwilling, but really put some challenges in front of me if we were going to go down this path.
Yes, she said, you write in the book, she said, well, what do you really believe in? I know you're
Right.
Jewish, but what is it that you believe
Well,
in?
and that's such a big question,
It
right,
is.
for Jews, because the question of belief for Jews is controversial for some. Some don't believe. It's not required to believe in God. It's a religion of law and practice. But I think a belief in God is actually fundamental, and I think that a kind of Jewish yearning for closeness to God is something that's in our liturgy, and it's certainly in the writings, and so in Tanakh and our sacred texts. But I thought that was important because it was a question of not just what you are culturally, ethnically, but how you live in the world, how you seek to live your faith. And again, I come back because I think it's relevant to the mission and the practice of federation, which is around what does it mean to be Jewish, but what are we to do with this tradition in the world, inside of our community, but not just inside our community, outside the community. How do we walk, how do we seek to build a civil society around universal values that we look at through the prism, through a Jewish prism. And I think that's what she was getting at, and it was a very important question because it spoke to issues which I think animate my own spiritual journey, which is, the translation of our liturgy in various spots talks about cultivating a greater awareness of ourselves and other people, and ourselves and other people in the wider world. And that, I think, is something that was, for a Protestant from New England, these are often people, particularly from New England, who don't talk about God, who don't talk about faith, they live their faith. And it's a belief in a strong work ethic and about serving the community. It is not to be as expressive about the search for God as I am. My wife is not into any of that. That's my trip. But she believed very much in sort of how do you live your faith.
Coming up, more with David Gregory on his unlikely spiritual journey.
Community, like every gift, counts. Together, we can ensure a vibrant Jewish future. Federation and you, changing the world together.
We're back with David Gregory talking about how's your faith and his journey for religion. And I just want to refer to your book. Again, you were very candid about your childhood and the pain that you went through. Is any of your journey based on trying to figure out where to place that pain?
Well, I mean, I guess I've always understood what you're referring to, my mother's alcoholism, and she was arrested when I was 15 and has now been sober for 30 plus years. So it turns out well in the end, as she's really redeemed, herself after such a difficult stretch of time. But I think for me, the path of searching for meaning and purpose in my life, in part was about figuring out what that family dynamic was about, what my response was, how I processed it all. And so as I thought about leading my own family in faith and wanting to get it right, I think trying to understand, where I was in that situation mattered. And I guess as I look back, what's striking to me is the absence of faith. You know, when you're a teenager and you're going through, as so many people do, you go through the
teenage angst in and of
right,
itself.
Teenage angst, and you go through insecurity and pain and upset and all these things. You want to rely on some figure in your life who says, you know what, this is tough, but it's going to be okay. And I think for me to look back and realize I didn't really have an adult who was telling me that. Not my father.
Your father?
No, not my mother, who was more impaired at that period of time. And the absence of belief in God to say, you know what, it's just, it's going to be okay. Trust in God, trust in something bigger than yourself. I think that's striking to me as I look back, and I think that, influenced a lot of what I try to learn, and certainly what I try to pass on to my kids.
I would think it would. I mean, think about your situation. You did describe that you kept everything inside. You had a lot of humiliating experiences as a teenager, both you and your sister, and you wouldn't tell anybody. You just kept it a secret. So not to have anything to fall back on and believe in had to be very difficult. I mean, you could have wound up. Look at how successful you wound up in a career, even in a career path. You could have just.
Yeah, but I mean, some of those difficulties did not mean an absence of parenting, or I mean, any of us could have taken a path that resulted in some real trouble for myself. But I was really very focused on what I wanted to do from an early age. I was a hyper ambitious person in my teenage years, and I think part of that was a response to things that were not working out well in my personal life.
Tell us about the title of the book and how President George Bush inspired you to name it.
I write about my admiration for President Bush and his own life of faith. I think there was an aspect of him I identified with, which is his struggle with alcoholism, given my mother's experience, and the fact that for him, turning to faith as a means of discipline and an attempt at self-refinement and self-protection is something very Jewish, actually, if you think about it. If you look at medieval philosophers and scholars who talked about self-refinement coming from the Torah, and that's really what it was meant to be. And so I felt that, in a very different way, for him to become born again and to be on a faith path was something that I found inspirational. His faith, I think, was often misinterpreted as a kind of guiding light for how he made decisions. I don't think he was an irrational president. There are certainly people who would disagree with him based on policies, but I don't think he was irrational based on his faith by any means. But he was aware through a mutual friend that I was studying with a well-known Jewish educator, Erica Brown, in the Washington area. And
she's Orthodox?
Yeah, she's modern Orthodox. And so he had heard about that, and I remember going to see him after I got the job at Meet the Press, and I went into the Oval Office and we were talking about a number of other things, and he said, Gregory, how's your faith? And he talked about, aspects of the job at Meet the Press that would be difficult, and he talked about his own path, how he was in the Bible every day, and what his faith had represented for him in the course of his presidency. And I think, as I write in the book, and I feel very strongly, I mean, no matter what you think of President Bush, he certainly left office with his faith intact, which I think is a real testament to him and to faith. And so, the reason the book has that title is, I think the question, as I thought at the time, it's odd to ask somebody that question, right?
Yes.
Especially a journalist covering them. But I knew that he knew the path that I was on, so I welcomed the question and was happy to discuss it with him. And I think the question itself is so penetrating because it really gets to this idea of, well, how's my faith? What does it mean to be a person of faith? Where and when is my faith the strongest? Would my life be different if my faith were stronger? And, I think I concluded, and as I talk about the book around the country, I've said, my answers to that question are no better than your answers, but I do think there is value in asking the question, and that's what he did.
That was very poignant, actually, what he did. You went around the country, as you said earlier, studying with various religious leaders. Can you tell us about your experience with Joel Osteen?
Yeah, I mean, I like Joel Osteen very much. I think, he's, there's something captivating about someone who has that much reach, who can bring a message of God and inspiration to that many people around the world. So he's a phenomenon in that way, and he's controversial
Very
within
much
Christianity
so.
and the evangelical movement, and there's lots of reasons for that, and I touch on some of that. I guess I came to him with an expectation that, I went to well-known leaders, even evangelical leaders, not to somehow resolve the conflict between Christianity and Judaism. That was not my point. My point was to appeal to people who had some pattern recognition and some experience with this idea of people asking themselves the questions that I was asking myself, which is, how's my faith? What does it mean to be a person of faith? How can I grow in faith? And I thought at certain points, because of some of my conversations, that he might be somebody, as an evangelical Christian, who said, look, you have to accept Christ. You either accept Christ or you don't. And that's kind of the answer. And that's not what he said to me. He said, look, I grew up in a particular tradition. But he talked about having a heart for God and how important it was to have a heart for God. And for me, as somebody who I think is on more of a spiritual quest within Judaism, that's kind of my thing. I like that language. I like that pursuit. That really spoke to me, because to me it was the idea of, what does it mean to have a heart for God? Again, I think from a Jewish liturgical perspective, it is to cultivate an awareness of being closer to God. In Psalm 16 talks about keeping God before me always, God in front of me always. And in that way, that's having a heart for God. That's being open to the lessons, the inspiration, the example of God. And I think that's what that's what's in our sacred teaching, and that's something that resonated with me.
Coming up, more with David Gregory.
From empowering Jewish college students to stand up to anti-Israel activity on campus, to enabling seniors and Holocaust survivors to age with dignity, transforming, inspiring, saving, Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County is doing all of this here and around the world.
We're back with journalist David Gregory. Tell me, David, have you been to Israel, and how does Israel play in your quest for your faith?
Look, I think to any Jew, Israel is extremely important as a kind of, as a Jewish homeland, as just a fundamental place in Jewish history of kind of the dream of Jewish safety, in the world. And I think Israel's always been important to me as I've begun to study, even, religiously for those reasons. And, just, I think as an American, to celebrate Israel as so many people do, I think I've always had those feelings. But I do think Israel is complicated. And I think one of my challenges for Jews around the country and to federations around the country is to say, how can we recalibrate Jewish identity to be less centralized around Israel and more around this concept of spiritual citizenship, how we live our faith, how we pursue our religion. To me, it's not a split of, just go become a religious Jew or go become a Zionist. It's just, how do we have a balance in Jewish identity between our care for and examination of Israel, and then our development of a Jewish identity that's about our spiritual citizenship and our tradition.
I think they will help each other.
Well, they can help each other, but I do think for many Jews in America, their Jewishness is defined by Israel. That never worked for me. I think Israel is an incredibly complicated country. It is its foreign policy, its internal policy, its interactions with the diaspora. All of it has this obvious tendency to polarize America and certainly the Jewish community. And I think that can be way too limiting. I may have opinions about the politics in Israel or about issues about the occupation of the Palestinian territories. But again, that's not what sets my soul on fire. And that's not going to define me Jewishly. It's not that it's not important, but I think for me it was not the animating force of my spiritual quest.
You studied with a number of journalists in D.C.,
Mm-hmm.
David Brooks, I think Jeffrey Goldberg. Do you still, since you've written the book, do you still meet with them on a regular basis?
Occasionally, I would say an irregular basis, we get together, but it's certainly interesting when we do because it's a mix of,
Great minds.
Well, and it's a, yeah,
And controversy.
those
And
guys are great
controversy.
minds. But it's also, it's a chance to talk about, the current state of Israel, but it's also a chance to dig in. I think there's something about community and learning in community that's really special. For me, being on a path of Jewish learning and growth was something that was very much individual. And I think learning in a group or being part of a community, whether it's federation or it's your synagogue or a group study, is highly rewarding because my teacher often says, you shouldn't be Jewish alone. And there's a great kind of family aspect to studying in a group and a lot of learning and a lot of love that can come from being in that environment. And that's what I like about that group. And it's obviously intellectually stimulating, but again, there's so much intellectual rigor in Jewish study. I tend to seek the transcendent, which I think is available too through those sessions.
I have to ask you this. Journalism is you pound at people. Journalists do, and then there's a tenet in Judaism called lashon hara.
Yeah.
How do you balance your journalistic fervor with your Judaism?
Well, I think lashon hara, the prohibition is against gossip, it's against the malicious speech. And I think it's, I love the sermons that have been given imagining that the microphone is always on, as if we were going through a whole day with a microphone on, and how would that impact our behavior in terms of what we said about each other, about our friends, about our family, about a perfect stranger. And we can all do better. I think as a journalist, that doesn't mean that there's not a place for scrutiny or analysis or criticism where it's warranted. I think that's a different thing than, malicious speech. And I think that as a journalist, I hope, just like as a human being, that I've tried to become more humble and have a sense of shrinking myself in the world a little bit, which in the rough and tumble of TV news is not so easy because it can be an arrogant place and a very self-involved place. But the extent to which any of us can kind of shrink ourselves and realize, we're not that important, gives us some humility when we're scrutinizing public officials. It's not about giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, but it's just bringing humility to the job, so you're not out there trying to delegitimize people or scrutinize them to the point beyond basic fairness.
Do you find that your faith has affected the way you're behaving in your current position as CNN?
Well,
political
I
analyst?
hope so. I hope it's easy to kind of focus in on political analysis and render judgments just through that lens. And I guess I hope that I'm a little less judgmental. That I think I've always been fair, but when I think about some of the edge I've had over time, or losing my temper, in the course of the job, I hope that that's mellowed with some awareness, some greater awareness of who I'm trying to be at every step. I think the key thing to remember for me, being on this path, is that it's not that I figured it out. It's not that I'm better than anybody. It's worse in a way, because it just means that your limitations and your failures are magnified because you may have a greater awareness of how flawed you are. So that's, I think, part of a more religiously aware life, is that you're constantly reminded of how often you screw it up.
That can be daunting. You write that your father originally was very uncomfortable with the book, and then yet will you tell the story about towards the end of his life, how it helped?
Well, he was, there's aspects of the book that were just in my childhood that made him very uncomfortable, especially reduced to the pages. And we worked through that. And then in the course of it, I think he really became fascinated with the religious search and didn't completely understand it. because it was not him. Didn't understand where it came from. And then as he became more vulnerable and he was getting sicker and more scared, I was in a position where I was able to teach him a little bit, teach from sources, Jewish sources, to try to offer some comfort.
It must have made you feel so good.
Yeah, it did make me feel great. Even, I remember toward the end of his life, I had come down with my kids down here to Florida. Actually, they were in Boca Raton, and his cousin was down, and we all got together for a Shabbat dinner. And I, organized it and led it, and it was such as Shabbat is, I think, as a ritual and a Shabbat dinner, it is a holy time. It is a time when we approach holiness and beauty in our lives. And my dad felt that, and I think it was just such an elevated feeling. And, again, as he got closer to death, I guess my faith helped me find the language to comfort him. And the day before he died, I was with him and then left him, and I did something that I would have never done growing up, or even, relatively, certainly beyond the last 10 years, and that was to pray with him, to pray from our Siddur, from Adon Olam, into your hands my soul I place, when I awake and when I sleep, God is with me, I shall not fear, body and soul from harm will he keep. And, it was just it was a wonderful moment of connection, and it was a way for me to then say goodbye. And I did, and the next day he died. And it was, as sad as that was, we don't often get to say goodbye in a way that I think is transcendent. And that, for me, it was a sweet parting. It was a moment of connection that was beyond father-son, and made it really special.
And I think, obviously, your study of faith and embracing the faith helped transfer the peace and tranquility to your dad. It was just such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it was. It was a great moment for us to end his life on.
Well, I can continue to talk forever with you, but we've run out of time. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And everyone should read this book. It's quite enlightening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Coming up, final thoughts on Mosaic. I hope you enjoyed this morning's conversation with David Gregory on his unique spiritual journey. You can watch this interview and all past episodes of Mosaic on Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County's website. Visit jewishpalmbeach.org/mosaic. And we'll see you again next Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. here on WPTV News Channel 5 as we explore the growing role of professionals in our local Jewish community. For now, have a great week and goodbye from Mosaic.